Today in Washington, all 41 Republican senators lined up, unified, along with one Democrat, Ben Nelson of Nebraska, and they all bravely insisted that Wall Street reform not be debated on the floor of the United States Senate. Just to be clear here, they did not vote Wall Street reform down. They voted to not allow it to be discussed. Even without Ben Nelson, Democrats have 58 votes in the Senate on this, a huge majority in favor of passing Wall Street reform. But Republicans are filibustering. They are insisting that it not even be talked about on the Senate floor, which is not to say the negotiations on this are over. Republicans say they do want to keep talking. They just don't want to do it in the Senate, you know, where people can see. Republican Senator Richard Shelby reportedly still trying to work out a deal with Democrat Chris Dodd. A number of Republicans considered possible votes for some version of reform in the end. But today's vote to not allow debate on the Senate floor really just means that Republicans want the political negotiations on Wall Street reform to happen away from the C-SPAN cameras, in private, off the Senate floor. This was not a vote on the merits of the bill. This was, hey, do you guys want to start talking about Wall Street reform? And the resounding reply from all 41 Republicans plus Ben Nelson was no. We do not want to start debating this. Whatever you hear in terms of Beltway common wisdom about this, believe me, it is not normal for things to take more than 50 votes to pass the Senate. A majority of a body of 500, mathematically speaking, a majority vote in the United States Senate is 50 plus 1. But on Wall Street reform, like on lots of things, Republicans aren't just voting no. They are using a procedural tool to keep a vote from even happening. Democrats have a majority on this. Republicans just won't let them take a majority vote. Ever since they lost control of Congress in the 2006 midterm elections, Republicans have become a finely tuned filibuster machine. See how the number of filibusters skyrockets there at the end in 2007? That's the voice of the Republican minority. Just since President Obama took office, Republicans have filibustered the stimulus, the tobacco regulation, extending unemployment benefits, health reform, of course. You know, actually, it's pretty much everything. Do we have a scroll of that? Yeah, as far as we can tell, Republicans have filibustered every major piece of legislation since President Obama took office. The only major actions we've been able to come up with that weren't filibustered were the nominations of the president's cabinet secretaries and the nomination of Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor. And that's because cabinet secretaries and Supreme Court nominees rarely, if ever, get filibustered. But never say never. Another Supreme Court nomination coming up this summer. But procedurally, this is the reality in the Senate. Republicans are filibustering everything. They are using Senate rules to block majority votes on almost every single nominee and on every significant piece of legislation, now including Wall Street reform. Even though that doesn't get talked about anymore, don't lose sight of it. Everybody keeps acting as though this is normal. It is not. This is not normal. The constant, ever-present, always-on filibuster has never happened before in the history of our country. This has never happened before in the history of the Senate. How Democrats will respond to the always-on filibuster in the case of Wall Street reform remains to be seen. Will Democrats manage to win over some Republican votes? Could they use the reconciliation procedure to get around the filibuster like they had to do on health reform? Nobody yet knows for sure. Procedurally, it is not at all clear what happens next. As I said, there's never been a case in American history where every single piece of legislation is filibustered. We've never done this before. But substantively, it is important to keep in mind what the Republicans are using the filibuster to block right now. They're blocking Wall Street reform now, when more than 2/3 of Americans say they want Wall Street reform. Everybody who understands that there is an economic crisis right now that was caused by a financial crisis, everybody who understands that wants the financial system to be fixed. So in practical political terms, how do you make the case that you're against financial reform? It's actually not going to be easy. Check out, for example, this email today from the estimable Tea Party Nation. This, I think, just makes clear how difficult it's going to be to make the case against Wall Street reform. Quote, "Today is the day that Harry Reid has scheduled a vote to try and cram the, quote, financial reform bill down our throats." By which they mean bring it up for a debate using a majority vote. That's cramming it down your throat in Tea Party speak. But back to the letter. This is the good part. Let me give you one horrific example of the stupidity in this bill. This bill will create liability for advertising agencies for ads that the Federal Trade Commission decides are aiding and abetting false advertising. Imagine you own an advertising agency. Your job is not to verify what a client is selling. Your job is simply to create the ad campaign that will drive customers to their doors. So that's the pitch. That's the Tea Party Nation pitch to their supporters about why financial reform is so bad and must be stopped. Their pitch is it wouldn't allow false advertising. Oh, the outrage! Imagine the poor Tea Party Nation email appeal writer who's tasked with putting together this message. How can we make Wall Street reform sound really bad? Would it sound bad if we asked Tea Party activists to imagine they were ad agency executives who didn't want to be held accountable for lying about what they were selling? Would that rile people up? Imagine the angry mob taking to the streets now. We want the right to make false statements in advertising. We demand the right of advertising executives to not be held liable for lying about what they're selling. Is this what we're supposed to be chanting? Could we make it rhyme? I don't know that this campaign against Wall Street reform, because it's against false advertising, is going to fit on a sign. I don't exactly know how this is going to work for them. Republicans might be taking every procedural advantage they have in Congress right now to stop Wall Street reform. But politically, in terms of the substance, in terms of trying to convince their base on this one, the political problems here are plain. Joining us now is Chris Hayes, Washington editor of The Nation magazine. Chris, thank you very much for coming on the show. Nice to see your glasses have been found.
Oh, they have. Thanks for having me. I think it was Ayn Rand who wrote Advertising Agency Owners of the World Unite.
I got this morning, and I got it on my BlackBerry before I was sitting down in my regular email on my computer, and I thought it was something that had been cleverly put together by one of the whiz kids on our staff. Like, wouldn't it be funny if this is what the Tea Party Nation had to resort to? It's amazing to me. How do Republicans sell this to their base that they're against Wall Street reform?
Well, I think actually, the more I think about it, and the more I think about this whole bailout thing, the more I think actually the bailout dog whistle is a way of trying to invigorate their base. I mean, one of the things I think you see is that the issue of the financial reform bill is not seizing the imagination even of the most hardcore conservative members of the Republican coalition, the Tea Party folks. This bill is not seizing their imagination. They're not showing up at town halls to oppose it in the way they were with health care. And I actually think the bailout attack wasn't even so much designed for the general public so much as it was just actually a first attempt of even trying to stoke some outrage and some energy amongst their own core supporters, which, you know, I don't really think is present. I just think we're not seeing the level of outrage there that we saw against the health reform bill on this bill.
And because they haven't been able to sort of gin up outrage about this among their base, they haven't been able to excite their base with this, and I think you're right in that observation. What happens next politically? What's their next step toward trying to stop it?
Well, I think there's there's sort of a branch in the tree here. I mean, one is that, you know, one imagines perhaps everything has changed and now the Republicans really, really care about their good faith objections to what's in the bill and are trying to make a good faith effort at negotiating. The other is that they're essentially stalling and they're trying to more or less hold up Wall Street for lots of contributions. And this is essentially what McConnell and Kyle were, McConnell and Cornyn were doing when they went to Wall Street. Is we stand between you and Wall Street reform, and the longer they can hold it up, the more they can probably get campaign cash. And then the third thing I think is possible is that they think if they stall, they can kind of rerun the healthcare arc, which is to say, if you look at the early polling on healthcare reform, it also was high, and the longer they dragged it out, the less popular it got. And so there's a thinking, I think, among some sectors, if they drag this out, the same thing will happen.
Democrats do seem to have cottoned to the idea, though, that if they allow it to be slowed down, it will be stopped. Yep. Democrats seem to have figured that out this time. They also seem to have figured out that they should fact-check their opponents when their opponents start to get away with saying things that aren't true about the legislation. My question, though, is whether or not Democrats have learned any lesson from health care, or whether they have a new lesson that they're trying to learn here about actually negotiating with Republicans. Are the negotiations actually happening?